conversation we're in is the roasting of the meat of the carbon, and whether you can get flavor from one thing that's roasted together with another in the oven. And this concept is called the issue of reicha, whether aroma is a form of infusion of flavor from something non-kosher to kosher. So we know that if you had a non-kosher food that's mixed in with a kosher, that it could prohibit it. You know that if it just touches and they're both hot, or in certain cases where one's hot and the other's not, so then it can infuse the flavor from the non-kosher to the kosher. And then we saw an opinion of reicha, that just the aroma can be transferred, and that was a machlokes between Rav and Levi. So we're going to see another machlokes here from Tanaim about this matter, and this is Ayin Vav Amud Beis 76b on the second wide line. Amar Amari Katanai. So Amari said this is actually this discussion, the machlokes between Rav and Levi, of whether or not there's a concept of reicha, and whether the aroma infusion is going to prohibit the food, is a machlokes tanaim. We already have it in a brisa or a mishnah. Hareda pas chama. So somebody's taking a hot bread out of the oven, and he put it on top of a barrel of wine on its opening, it seems. And so the wine aroma can now be absorbed by the hot bread. But the problem is that the wine is shel teruma, is teruma wine, and therefore the aroma of the wine would make the bread infused with teruma, and only somebody that's allowed to eat teruma is allowed to eat the bread. So Rameh says, indeed, it's prohibited to anybody that's not allowed to eat the teruma. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it would be permissible to everyone else as well. Rabbi Yossi makes a distinction. He says, he says if it's wheat, it's going to be permissible because it won't absorb as much. But if it's barley bread, then it will be prohibited because it will absorb. Because the sa'urim, the barley, will absorb that aroma. My love, Tanai. So wouldn't you say, just as we have machlokes Tanaim there, whether or not aroma comes through, and that's the basis of this machlokes. The mas of a reicha milzi, one says aroma is of no significance and it would not prohibit it. The aroma of a non-kosher, or in this case a teruma food that you're not allowed to eat, would be of no significance and does not prohibit the food. And the other says no, it does. So the Gemara says, Levi vadai tanoi. Levi is going to have to learn that indeed, since he says there's no such thing as aroma, he's going to have to say that in at least the opinion of Rabbi Meir in this Mishnah is going to say that there is such a matter of aroma that could prohibit food. However, Rav said that aroma is of significance and could prohibit food. Perhaps he would say everybody agrees to that. And here there's a distinction. Tanoi in name of Tanoi, Amal Charav, so Rav says no. The Kuli Alma Reicha Milsi. Everybody in this brisa or Mishnah could agree that there is such a thing as aroma, and aroma would prohibit food if it comes from a source of a non-kosher food or teruma, and you're not kohen. But however, there's an explanation. Lavitma Allah Dahi, had we not learned the brisa about that Mishnah, Amar Rabba Bar Chana Amar Reish Lakish, that Rabbi Bachana sent name of Shlakish to explain that Mishnah. But if it's hot bread and he took it out of the oven and put it on top of an open barrel, everybody would agree it's prohibited. Meaning because there's an infusion of aroma which would prohibit. And if you have cold bread on top of a sealed barrel, everybody's going to say there's no aroma there and it's permissible. So rather, the machlokes is if you have a hot bread on top of a sealed barrel. do we say that the aroma is strong enough that the hot bread's going to absorb the aroma even through the seal? Or pas sanenes, it's cold bread, but v'chavis psucha, but it's an open barrel, and then the aroma is strong enough that maybe you can infuse it. And this would be like an open barrel with a hot bread. So Tani Rav Kahana Bereder Rav Chinana Saba. Rav Kahana taught in the name of Rav Chinana Saba. Pas sha'afem tzli. If you bake bread in an oven together with a meat that's roasting, matanor asalacha b'kutcha. So you can't eat that bread with kutach, with a dairy dip. And it's not the same as baking bread in a dairy, with meat, which you're actually not allowed to eat at all. We saw that earlier in the Masechta that you're not allowed to bake bread with either dairy or milk, dairy or meat, because if you do, then you may end up eating the bread with the opposite type, because bread is eaten with cheese and bread and cream cheese and etc. and butter, and it's also eaten as a sandwich with meat. So if you make the bread with dairy, there's a concern that you're going to eat it with meat. So that's going to be prohibited. Even to just eat it plain, it's prohibited to be eaten. Over here, this is different because it's not really infused with it doesn't really have the meat in it. It just has an aroma of the meat. And so he says that you can eat it, but you can't eat it together with dairy. And Tosfos over here says that would be the halacha. However, we follow the halacha that recha lav milsi. However, lechatchila one should be strict if they can. Ahu benisa, this fish, the itava bahadi bisra, that was roasted together with meat. So Rabbi Parzika said that you should not eat it with dairy, again, because it was roasted in the same oven as they had meat. Mar Baravashi Amar. However, Mar Baravashi, he said, you can't eat it at all, because since there is aroma, and we know that fish and meat can if you mix them, they can give a person an ailment of some sort, because it'll give you bad breath and some ailment, something like a leprosy, and therefore even over here that is just baked together should be prohibited. That's the end of the halachas of what we learned, the halachas of kosher, from the halachas of where of roasting together. We saw the halachas of the infusion of flavor from something hot to something cold, the infusion of aroma, and whether that's prohibited or not, in the two opinions, and ultimately that the halacha being like Levi, that aroma is lav milsi, recha lav milsi. It's not a matter of concern, but nevertheless, some are strict, at least lechatchila. The next Mishnah deals with the underlying concept that we had of that the carbon pesach is allowed to be brought even though somebody is tamei, if the majority of Klal Yisrael is tamei. So it can be brought batuma, and then we said the halacha is that if the majority of Am Yisrael is tamei, and spiritually impure, so then you're not allowed to. Normally, if it's an individual, you're not allowed to bring the carbon pesach, and you would have to bring it the second pesach, being the 14th day of Iyar. But being that the majority of the community is tamei, then you bring the carbon pesach, and it's actually eaten, which is distinct from all other kabbanas that have this idea that you can bring a communal offering when the community is tamei, because there you cannot eat it; you can only bring it. And that's what this mission is. Chamisha devarim. There are 5 types of karbanos, ba'in betuma, that you would bring it as a communal offering betuma because it has a set time, so you have to bring it on that day. You're not allowed to eat them in tuma. What are they? Ha'omer, the second day of Pesach in the morning, they would bring the new barley, cut down some new barley sheaves, and bring a minchas ha'omer, a meal offering to the Beis Hamikdash, and that permits the new grain to be eaten. Ushtei halechem, and the 2 breads that are brought on Shavuos at the end of the 49 days of counting from the omer, from the cutting down of the barley sheets, until you bring the wheat bread, 2 wheat breads that come on Shavuos, and they permit the new grain in the Beis Hamikdash, whereas the Omer permits the new grain for everybody for personal use. In the Beis Hamikdash, a new grain can only come after Shavuos with the Shtei Alechem, with the 2 wheat breads. So those 2 would be brought, even if the majority of the community tamei, and so the grains are going to come, even though they're tamei, they would be brought. But the remainder, both of these, the halacha is as a meal offering, a part goes to mizbeach, but the rest are eaten. There is no eating of these because they are tamei. V'lachem apanim, and the showbreads, the 12 breads that were on the table from week to week, and on Shabbos they were taken off and given to the Kohanim. Again, the portion that goes on the mizbeach, which is the frankincense, these bowls of frankincense, they're going to go on the mizbeach, even though they're tamei, but the breads are not eaten with tumah. V'zivchei shal mitzvah, and shalomim offerings that are a communal shalomim offering, which is the offerings on Shavuos, on the holiday Shavuos, that are brought as a peace offering. Also, a communal offering is specific on that day, and therefore it is brought on the mizbeach, but is not eaten. And the goats of Rosh Chodesh, which come as a communal offering, also, if they became tamei, they're brought nevertheless as a communal offering, as a community being tamei, but not, and they have a set time for Rosh Chodesh, but they're not going to be eaten. However, a Pesach Shabbat B'tumah, a carbon Pesach, which is brought as a tamei offering, necha b'tumah, it's also eaten when it's tamei. Because the carbon Pesach from the start is made to be eaten, as the Torah says, Lafi achlo, according to how it's eaten, how many can eat it. So you see that it is from the start made to be eaten. So Chamisha, since the Mishnah didn't just list them, it said there are 5, it's coming to exclude something. What's it excluding? That excludes the Chagig offering, the holiday offering, the Chag offering that comes on the 15th day of Nisan, which is the first day of Pesach, also the 15th day of Tishrei, the first day of Sukkot, as well as on Shavuos, the joyous offering. Now, the reason is because even though that it has a set time, it's supposed to be brought the first day, but you can bring a make-up date the rest of the Chag as well. And even Shavuos, which is only that day, you can also bring it for the 7 days after that. So the Saka, I may have thought, even the carbon tzibur, since it's a communal tzibur, and it has a set time, Tidchi Tuma, it should supersede the Tuma and be brought, even though it's Tamei Kamash Malan. That's why our Mishnah tells us only these 5 to tell you, Kivan the Islay Tashlumin, since the Chagiga offering can be brought not only that first day of Yantiv, but also for the next 7 days. There's a 7 days. Kol Shiva, you have a 7-day period of bringing it. Lei Dachya. It doesn't supersede Shabbos. And if it doesn't supersede Shabbos, it also doesn't supersede Tumah. So Gemara says, okay, great. So we mentioned the 5, and it excludes the Chagiga of Yantiv. But why didn't you also mention the goats that are brought on the holiday on Chag? So the Gemara says, no, it's included. It says the peace offerings, the shlamim, of Yantiv, which is a communal offering. So now, so why don't we include and think that includes the Rosh Chodesh offering, the goats of Rosh Chodesh? Because it should be included in the communal peace offerings. Amri, so the Gemara answers that no. And the goats of Rosh Chodesh are different, because I may have thought they're not included because they don't have a set time, even though they're a set time for Rosh Chodesh, but it's not considered a moed, it's not an appointed time. That's what we may have thought. And now we're on 77a, Ein Zayin Amid Aleph at the top. And I need to specifically mention the Rosh Chodesh goats because I may have thought it doesn't say that it is an appointed time. And so we need to tell you that no, it is considered an appointed time and a set time for this carbon that cannot be changed. And Kedabaya, like Abaya has a proof text from Eicha. the Amar Abaye said, Tammuz the Haishato, the Tammuz, the month of Tammuz, which was a month the month that the spies, that the Meraglim were in Eretz Yisrael, having been sent by Moshe. We know that it says in the pasuk that they traveled for 40 days in Eretz Yisrael, and when they came back, they slandered and the Eretz Yisrael, spoke about what wasn't good about it, and weakened the heart, the resolve of the people by telling them this is way too hard. We shouldn't go into the land. And as a result of that, the Torah says that they were in the desert for 40 years, 1 year for each day that they traveled. Now, the Gemara tells us in Tainus that actually that day that everybody cried because they had accepted the report from the spies was the day of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, and they left on the 29th day of Sivan, which means that if you count 40 days, it would actually be the 10th day of Av. If Tammuz, the month in between, only had 29 days. However, if the month in between had a full 30 days, so then it would actually be on the 9th of Av, the calculation. So that's what Abaye says, Tammuz Daishata, the month of Tammuz, being the fourth month of the year, had Miluya Melua. They filled it, meaning it had 30 days. As we know, the lunar cycle is not 29 days nor 30 days. It's 29 and a half and change days. And so every month, the designation new moon by the witnesses is going to be either on the 29th day or the 30th day. And in that year, the month of Tammuz would have been a 30-day month, which brought the Tisha B'Av, the crying of Tisha B'Av of the community of Bnei Yisrael on account of the report from the spies that it actually came out to be on Tisha B'Av itself. And Hashem said, you cried for naught that night. You didn't trust in me. This will be a night of crying every year on account of, in the future, on account of the destruction of Beis HaMikdash. And it says over there in Eicha, in the lamentation about the destruction of Beis HaMikdash, and you called upon me a set time, meaning that you pronounced Rosh Chodesh a day late in order that the 9th of Av be the set time, Lishbor Bachuroi, to break the chosen ones. In other words, that the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was predestined on the 9th of Av on account of the extra day of Tammuz that year. So we see that the Rosh Chodesh is a moed, is accounted for as an extra, as a set day. So what you're saying is that we all learn it from the word moed, menanimi. So how do we know this? The Gemara says that Tana Rabbanan, we learned the Brisa taught Vaydaber Moshe Me'adei Hashem al Bnei Yisrael. Moshe spoke the appointed times, the holidays of Hashem to Bnei Yisrael. Why do we need that to be said? We only know from Tamid and Pesach, as we saw earlier, the daily offering and the Korban Pesach, since it says by both of them, in its appointed time, in its appointed time, even if it's Shabbos, and it's appointed time, even if it is Batuma. How do we know other communal offerings also have to be in a set time, even on Shabbos, and even if the community is Tami? It says, these shall you do for Hashem in your appointed times, in your holidays. So that's good for the holidays. But what about the Omer, which is the offering of the new grain from the barley, and all that comes along with it, and Shtei Halechem, and the two breads that come on the Chag Shavuos, on Shavuos, the 50th day from the Omer, which is two breads from wheat, and all that comes along with it. Moshe spoke the appointed times of Hashem. All of these listed, all of the holidays listed there are the appointed times. The Torah said it as an appointed time. Echad lekulam, one for all of them, meaning that they all have the same rule that they supersede Shabbos and supersede Tumah. So why do I need a special pasuk for Pesach and the Talmud and a special one for the holidays? I need a special teaching. If it had just mentioned the daily offering that it supersedes Tumah and Shabbos, because it's a constant. It's every day. You do it in the morning, the evening, and so it supersedes Shabbos, and it even comes in the community's tummy. The Kollel, and besides for that, it's constant. It also entirely goes up on the mizbeach. It's an ascent offering that the entire thing goes up on the mizbeach. So perhaps those two strengths tell you that it supersedes Shabbos and Tumah. Aval Pesach. But the Korban Pesach, which gets eaten for the most part by the group that it's connected to, and it's not a constant diet. Actually, it's only one day a year. So like maybe it should not supersede Shabbos and Tumah Kamashmul, and that's why we need a special teaching from Ma'adai for that. Because Rachman Pesach, and if the Torah had said so in regards to Pesach offering, Pesach Shu Anish Kares, there's a strength in Pesach that if you don't bring it, the punishment is kares, the soul is cut off from its source. It's a very severe punishment. So that's why it supersedes even Shabbos and Tumah. Aval Tamid ain't on kares, but perhaps Tamid, which does not have this punishment of kares. Perhaps it does not supersede Shabbos and Tumah, right? That's why I need a special teaching for each one. It's a point of time to tell you each one of these, both the daily carbon and the Tamid, supersede Shabbos and Tumah. Great. Because if the Torah had only said these two, I may have said it's only unique to these two. Because each one has its own strength. The Tamid, the daily offering, is constant and entirely on the Mizbeach. Pesach Shuanash Karas, and the Pesach's strength is that it has a punishment of Kares, so therefore it should go. These two should supersede Shabbos and Tumah. But other communal offerings, perhaps those do not supersede Shabbos and Tumah, and that's why I need a special teaching. You do these in its appointed time to tell you do it in its appointed time, even if it's time, even if the community is tummy. Now, because if the Torah had only said it for the holidays, that's good for communal offerings that come for atonement. However, but the Omer offering on the second day of Pesach, which comes to permit you to eat the community to eat their grains from that year, and the two breads, the shtei alechem, the two wheat breads that come on Shavuos, which permit the Beis Hamikdash to start using the grains from that year. Those don't atone. They're just making something permissible. So push it off a day. It won't be permissible to eat your grains. So what? It's not to atone for the community. It's to permit something for the community. Perhaps that's all it's doing. Perhaps it should not supersede Shabbos and Tumah Kamash Malon. That's why we have the special teaching of B'maya Dechem for these to tell you that they are a moed and they supersede Shabbos and Tumah. Now, because if the Torah had only said these two, so the Gemara is asking, great, so this is the least likely to be needed on Shabbos and Yantiv, Shabbos and Tumah. So then, from the fact that the Torah said these supersede Shabbos and Tumah, I don't need a teaching for anything else. I may have thought Adarabah. Perhaps it's the reverse. Maybe there's a strength in these two that they permit the grains for the community to be eaten, and they permit it for the Beis Hamikdash to use it. The Boin Lahatir, Aval Hanach Loi, but others that are atonement, maybe you have to wait for after Shabbos and Tumah when it's the right time to bring it, Kamash Mala. So therefore, it needs to be brought in its proper time, and we have a special teaching for each one of these. To understand the next Gemara, we have to understand a couple of important halachas. One, there's a concept, whenever we say that one mitzvah supersedes another prohibition or another concept, we have to analyze and see whether that's a concept of dechuya. Really, the prohibition is in place, but the mitzvah supersedes the prohibition. And therefore, I still need some sort of management of the prohibition. It could be that I'm going to do as little of the prohibition, transgress as little of the prohibition as possible, etc. Or do we say it's hutra, it's completely permissible? I'll give you an example. We know that if somebody's ill on Shabbos in a life-danger position, illness, that you have to break Shabbos in order to heal them, which is understandable. Now, if I say hutra, it's completely permissible, so you just go ahead and do whatever you need. If it's dechuya, so then you limit it to what absolutely needed, and because it's only superseding. But if you don't need it, it doesn't supersede. Also, if I can avoid doing myself, I can get somebody else to do it. If I can, I look for alternatives because the prohibition is still in place. It just supersedes it. Or do we say the prohibition is now no longer a prohibition, it's permissible? That's the two ways of looking at this. So over here, when we say, let's say the Korban Pesach, you're bringing the Pesach even though the community is tummy. Does that mean it's now no longer prohibited to be brought when the community is tummy? That's no longer a prohibition? Or do we say, no, the prohibition is in place, but this mitzvah supersedes the prohibition? That's the two ways of looking at it. And there are going to be ramifications. One ramification we could see is that, as a rule, we say that whenever there is a mistaken tumah or a korban brought betuma while there's a ritual impurity, that sits the golden plate with Hashem's name on it that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wears on his forehead, that will atone, as the Torah says, it's l'ratzon, that this atones for a korban brought betuma. Now, if I say that it's totally permissible, I don't need the Kohen Gadol's plate to atone for it, that sits to atone for it. However, if it's dechuya, meaning it's superseding the prohibition, but the prohibition is in place, so then I do need the Kohen's tzitz to atone for it. So that's going to be one ramification. And there's and by extension, another interesting conversation, because the Kohen Gadol doesn't always wear that plate on his forehead. So the question is, does the Kohen Gadol have to be wearing it on his forehead to atone or not? When does a Kohen Gadol not wear it? Well, one, if he's taking a nap, he's out at home or something. But even in the service itself on Yom Kippur, he changes out of the golden clothing into the white clothing. And yet we're going to see that it could be that it supersedes there as well. So this will help us understand these concepts. One, do we say hutra u'dechuya, totally permissible or still prohibited, but it supersedes? Two, do we need the Kohen Gadol to atone for the bringing the korban in tumah? And three, does the Kohen Gadol's being brought betuma atone for something betuma even if he's not wearing it? So now the Gemara is going to get into this conversation. Savrua, it was thought, everybody's going to say that the concept that when the community is tummy, that you can bring a korban, that prohibition still stands, the prohibition of bringing a korban when tummy. Nevertheless, you bring it because the mitzvah supersedes the prohibition, but the prohibition is still in place. And therefore you still require the tzitz, the Kohen Gadol's plate that's on his forehead, in order to atone for and for the bringing of the korban while tumah, and actually to make it a kosher korban. The lekatana the shamas lay the ama tumah hutra b'tzibur. Ela Rabbi Yehuda, because there's only one opinion that says that the prohibition of tumah is no longer there when the community is tummy. In other words, as we explained, the first opinion and the majority opinion is going to say that the mitzvah of the korban in the proper time supersedes the prohibition of tumah, but the prohibition of tumah is in place, and therefore I need the atonement of the tzitz. Whereas The Rabbi Yehuda, he says, no, actually the prohibition of Tumah is hutra, became permitted. It's not a prohibition at all, and I don't need the atonement at all. The Tanya, as we learned, tzitz, the plate, or the golden plate on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, the tzitz, Rabbi Shimon says whether the Kohen Gadol is wearing it or not, it'll atone and allow for the carbon brought in Tumah to be valid. However, Rabbi Yehuda says no, only if it's on his forehead. But if it's not on his forehead, it will not count as a valid carbon. Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon said to Rabbi Yehuda, what do you mean it has to be on his forehead? If it could be, it's not, I can show you a time where it's not on his forehead and it's going to count as valid. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur is not wearing at some parts of the surface of the Avodah on Yom Kippur, he's not wearing the tzitz because he doesn't wear the golden clothing. And yet, if the carbon became tameh on that day, he's still going to bring it and it'll count as a valid carbon because the tzitz will have atoned for it and make it valid. So you see that it doesn't have to be worn at that time. So Yehuda responds, no, it always has to be worn. And over there, the reason is because it's an obligatory carbon of the day, so it actually is permissible to be brought that way. It's a communal tumah. When the Kohen Gadol is tameh in Yom Kippur, that's a communal offering with a communal tumah, and it's permissible to be brought. In other words, he says it's not an existent prohibition that something supersedes, and I still need to atone for the fact that it's being brought with a prohibition. No, the prohibition is gone. The prohibition does not apply in such a place at all. And from there I can deduce that Rabbi Shimon says that the concept of bringing the carbon in a communal carbon when there's tumah is going to be a dechuya. It's just going to supersede it, but actually the prohibition is still there. With the Kollel, it's maratza lachilas. Now, there's another concept. Right now, the Gemara is going to assume, and later the Gemara is going to retract this aspect, that the tzitz, when it atones for a carbon and makes a carbon valid, even though that it's tameh, it only does so to make the service in the Beis HaMikdash kosher. But it does not make it kosher that now everybody can eat from the meat. No, it's tameh. You can't eat that meat. It's only going to allow for the carbon to go onto the mizbeach, or the blood to be spritzed on the mizbeach. So eina tzitz maratza alachilos, but that which is consumed of the carbon, and at this point the Gemara thinks even the part that goes on the mizbeach, that the fire of the mizbeach consumes, which is also a type of eating, right? Is also going to; those are not going to be permissible. The lekatana, the shamas leidama tzitz maratza alachilos elo Rabbi Eliezer, because the opinion that says that the tzitz is going to atone and make valid this carbon, not only for the spritzing of the blood on the mizbeach, but also for the consuming of the carbon. That's only the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanya Rabbi Eliezer says hatzitz maratza lachilas, that the tzitz is going to atone and validate the carbon even for eating it. And Rabbi Yossi said, Rabbi Yossi says no, and this is the majority opinion, that the tzitz does not atone for eating. It only atones for the having spritzed the blood on the mizbeach. Name it masmit the like Rabbi Yeshua. Now, let's say, having said all this, let's say that our Mishnah, which says that the communal carbon can be brought, is not going to be the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. Why? The Tani we learned, V'sisa l'secha basavada. The pasuk says, and you will bring your ascent offering, the meat and the blood. And Rabbi Yeshua says you can't spritz the blood unless you have meat to be consumed, and you can't consume the meat unless you have spritzed the blood. Meaning, if either all the blood spilled and you don't have any way to spritz the blood, you cannot eat the carbon. And also, if you don't have any of the meat to be consumed, and as we'll see later, it doesn't only mean that the kohen can eat it, but even if one kazayas, one olive size of even just the fats of the carbon which go on the mizbeach to be consumed by the fire of the mizbeach, then you can spritz the blood. But you would have to have some form of consumption as well, not only the spritzing of the blood. Now, in our Mishnah, we understood it to mean that only the spritzing of the blood is going to be permissible. As it says in our Mishnah, you can bring the korban, but you cannot eat it. And then Gemara understands eating, consuming, whether the people, the Kohanim, or the owner consuming it, or the Mizbeach consuming it. And so since Rabbi Yeshua requires that you have at least some meat and some of the blood so that you can spritz and also consume the meat, so Rabbi Yeshua, in dam and basa and dam, if you can't do one, you can't do the other. And in our Mishnah, we said that, you can bring the korban while tamei, but you cannot consume the korban while tamei. Wait, according to Rabbi Yeshua, they have to go hand in hand. Rabbi Eliezer, it's Rabbi Eliezer that says, dam af b'shem basar, you can spritz the blood of the mizbeach even though there's no meat left, or no meat to be consumed. Like in this case where it became tamei. And where did he learn it? From the same pasuk. After it says, you will bring your ascent offering, the meat and the blood, it says, v'dam zavachacha yishafech, and the blood of your offering you will pour out on the mizbeach. So why does it say first the meat and the blood? It's coming to teach another thing. That when you do bring the meat on the mizbeach and you put the parts that go on the altar itself onto the fire, you don't place it on the fire. You stand on the ramp and you toss it from the ramp. The kohen would toss it from the top of the ramp onto the pyre where the fire is. And as we've learned, there was a gap between the ramp and the altar itself, which reminded the kohen, stop there and toss from there. Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Yeshua, what does he do with Rabbi Eliezer's proof from the fact that it says, and you will pour the blood, which tells you the blood alone is an independent part of the korban. So Rabbi Yeshua says, actually, Rabbi Eliezer is telling you only 3 words of the pasuk, but he's not looking at the last 2 words of the pasuk. The last 2 words, it says also that the meat shall be consumed. So it says twice. It says the meat and the blood shall go up on the mizbeach, and it says you will pour the blood on the mizbeach, and the meat will be consumed. So you can't tell me that you can bring the blood and spritz it if there's no meat to be consumed. No, the end of the verse actually doubles that and says it again. And now we turn to Ayin Zayin Amud Beis. So why do we need it twice? So according to Rabbi Yeshua, why does it say the same thing twice? One is to tell you if it all goes on to the Mizbeach itself. So the consumption is talking about the Mizbeach consuming it. And one is talking about the Shalomim where the owner eats it, and that's a different type of consumption. And I need to tell you both of these. It's Tzricha, the Kasam Rachman Ba'oilov, and only said it by the ascent offering. Havamina Oilu, the Chamira. The ascent offering, where all of it goes on the Mizbeach, that's strict. Shekain Kollel, because all gets burnt on the Mizbeach, and therefore, if you don't have a part for the Mizbeach, you only have the blood, that's why it's going to be invalid. But but the part that the Kohen's going to eat, or the owner is going to eat, that if you don't have that part, you can still bring the blood and spritz on the Mizbeach, because that's not so important, because it's not a part that goes on the Mizbeach. The Lechamiri, it's not so strict. So perhaps even if you only have the blood and not the consumed parts, it will also be okay. Because and if the Torah had said by Shlomim, by a peace offering where the owner eats it, where there's a requirement to have the meat and the blood, and otherwise you can't bring any part. There actually there's 2 types of consumptions, because even though the owner eats part, which is what we call proper eating, but there's also a consumption of the mizbeach, because some parts of it go on top of the altar. So you now have the blood spritz, part going on the altar, and the owner eating it. So there I need at least some type of consumption happening besides for the blood being spritzed. But perhaps I may have thought the Ola ascent offering, where all of it goes onto the altar, so on the mizbeach. So maybe if you just have the blood and spritz on the mizbeach, that's sufficient. And that's why we need twice the Torah to tell us that in the same verse, in the same pasuk, the Torah tells it twice, habas of adam, and that the meat and the blood have to go up, and that you spritz the blood on the mizbeach, and that the meat needs to be eaten, to tell you that you have to have both. You have to have the blood on the mizbeach and some type of meat being consumed. Otherwise, it's not a valid korban. You can't bring it. Rabbi Eliezer nami haksiv abasa v'tayachil. And now we go back to Rabbi Eliezer, who said that actually you can just spritz the blood even though there's no meat left. It got tamei, for instance, and so you're not allowed to bring it. And we explain that that's the meaning of our Mishnah, because Rabbi Yeshua said that you need to also consume the meat, and in our Mishnah it says that you only bring the korban, you don't consume the meat. So he's going to explain, even though that the end of the verse does say, the end of the pasuk does say, that teaching we need, that you can, to tell you the moment, you know when you're allowed to eat the meat if you're a kohen or the owner, once the blood has been spritzed on the mizbeach. So then maybe the entire verse is just coming to that. How do we know that you can spritz the blood even though that there is no meat left? Why did it say it in this order? Since it says in this order, like it says at the beginning, first it says the meat and then it says the blood. You'll make the korban, the meat, and the blood. So to over here it should say so. Why did it say the spritzing first? To tell you the spritzing is independent of the rest of it. So that's the way Rabbi Eliezer teaches it. And the last thing teaches you that you can only eat the meat once the blood has been spritzed. Now, Rabbi Yeshua, how does he know this halacha? How does he know that you can only eat the meat once the blood has been spritzed? He says that's a logical conclusion. It's an a fortiori argument. If the parts that go on the mizbeach, that if you don't have them, they don't invalidate the korban. Ki isnu ma'akvi. Yet when you do have them, you have to wait for them, and otherwise you're not allowed to eat the korban until that part goes on the mizbeach. Down. But the blood, if you don't have any blood left of the korban, ma'akiv, it's going to invalidate the korban. For sure, ki ise, when you do have it, for sure you're not allowed to eat from the korban unless you spritz the blood on the mizbeach. So how does Rabbi Eliezer respond to that? After all, we do have a proof, just a logical proof. Rabbi Eliezer, he says, yeah, it's true that we could have learned it without the verse, but the verse is coming to tell you something, even though that logically you would know it anyhow, the Torah is explicitly telling it to you. Rabbi Yeshua says it's true that that's sometimes the Torah, even though you have a kal v'chomer, a weak and light argument, meaning something is more severe, so for sure the halacha would be that way. Nevertheless, the Torah does sometimes say it explicitly, but only if I don't have any other teaching from there. But if I have another teaching, but I have another teaching, here I have another teaching of to tell you that you need to have the meat there at the same, some meat consumed in order to spritz the blood. So we're going to learn that. Now that we've proven that according to Rabbi Yeshua, you don't spritz the blood unless there's some meat that can go on the mizbeach or can be consumed by the owner. And yet our Mishnah said that these korban, that's tummy, you're going to bring it even though you can't eat any of it, none of it's consumed. Let's say our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yeshua, the kiva ne'ama in entirety, since he says you need both the meat and the blood, not just the blood. And we also said that v'tzitz achilas lamaratz, and we also assumed that he would follow this opinion, that the tzitz, the golden plate on the Kohen's forehead, does not atone for the consumption of the meat. It only atones for the spritzing of the blood and the making of the korban. While tamei, say hey chasa b'tumah. So how can you bring such a korban while tamei? You need to. You can't spritz the blood unless there's meat that's consumed. You can't have the meat consumed because the tzitz won't atone for it. And we said that the prohibition is still in place. It's just that the mitzvah supersedes. But you have to somehow deal with the prohibition. So the Gemara says, no, we could say it's Rabbi Yeshua, and our assumption is wrong. That even though we say that Rabbi Yeshua says that you cannot eat the meat in Tumah on the basis of the tzitz, but it will atone for what goes on the mizbeach. That type of consumption of the meat that goes on the that the fire consumes on the mizbeach, that sits will atone for that. So it says, okay, hatenach zavachim. That's great if you're dealing with zavachim, you're dealing with offerings that have meat and blood. Oilin, because some part goes on the mizbeach. But the meal offerings, which actually don't have any parts that go on the mizbeach, other than the part that the kohen takes with his fistful, and that counts as the blood. That's the equivalent of the blood. So deleka oilin, but no other part goes on the mizbeach. It's all consumed by the kahanim. Michael and Mema, what are you going to say about that? Amri. So we say ki amar b'shua nami to be in entirety bezvachim menachas. When does he say that you require blood and meat to be consumed? The blood can be spritzed if meat's consumed. That's only true by blood and meat. By a korban, but by a meal offering, that you only have the one fistful, the komets, that goes on the mizbeach, that's equivalent to the blood, and you don't actually eat you need for the other part to be consumed in order for it to be a valid korban. Tomorrow, the Gemara is going to challenge this idea of menachos, of the meal offerings. But for now, that's the explanation we have that Rabbi Yeshua is going to say in our Mishnah, that you can spritz the blood because there's also, even though he requires that some part be consumed, it's sufficient for the part that goes on the mizbeach to be consumed, and that it can be brought even in Tumah, because the tzitz will atone for that as well.